In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen. Veni Sancti Spiritus repletuorum correre fidelium et tui amore sine signum accende, mite spiritum tuum et creabuntur.
Et renovabis faciem tere.
Oremus Deus qui correre fidelium Sancti Spiritus illustratione nocovisti, darubis in iarem spiritu recta sapere, et te eius semper consolatione godere per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sede sapientiae.
Ora pro nobis.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. What's that? Oh, sorry. Okay, so we are on the brain of Pope St. Damasus. Started that last time. We'll back up a little bit from where we were last time. Darius mentions that the East with one accord turns its eyes towards the supreme head of Catholicity, meaning, of course, the Roman Pontiff. Everywhere, all those who claim to be Christians at this time, well, perhaps aside from some heretics, all acknowledge that the Roman Pontiff does indeed have jurisdiction over the entire Catholic Church, over the entire divinely established Church of Christ, of which there is, of course, only one. And this was recognized, again, by all those, in fact, those who actually deserve the name Christian everywhere, both East and West at this time, that whatever divisions there were between those who submitted to the Roman Pontiff and those who did not, it was not on the basis of geographical location. There were some who perhaps claimed the name, but who were in fact heretics, who adhered to Arianism or to any of the other various heresies that we've talked about. There are quite a few even at this time. The first few centuries of the Church were by no means free of heresy. So really never a time in which there is no heresy of some kind, even in the best of times. There are still theological diligence is in fact necessary. So at this time, definitely this particular era that we're looking at in the history of the Church is definitely one of general improvement for the Church in certain ways. Certainly with regard to the state, there's no more persecution of the Catholic Church by the Roman Empire. In fact, the Roman Empire is becoming a Catholic state. And we'll see that, we're seeing that now. The emperors are, of course, Julian the Apostate was an exception, but by now emperors are baptized, receiving baptism, and they are getting very actively involved, in fact, in some instances, far too actively involved in theological questions. Constantius, yes, was very interested in those things, but he had the wrong ideas. Clearly, he was not qualified to be involved in that. And in any case, I was a heretic. In fact, he adhered to heresy and bankrupted the imperial treasury by paying for so many councils, which were really mostly just problematic. So that's disordered, obviously. But you see clearly, not only is it okay to call oneself a Christian now in the Roman Empire, but the emperors themselves are calling themselves that, whether correctly or not, whether they actually themselves adhere to the faith and therefore, properly speaking, are Catholics in every sense, holding the Catholic faith, not only being legally members of the Church, but actually holding the Catholic faith. That's another question. But we have emperors now who are receiving baptism, whether shortly before they die or long before, and so that is, to that extent, you see a sign of the generally improving things, the state of affairs for the Church. But there is never any shortage of problems. Not at any time in the history of the Church is there really a shortage of problems, and there's never a lack thereof. There's always something going on that the Church has to deal with. Even in the best of times, there are still some issues. Even in the High Middle Ages, when the system was essentially perfect, when everything was ordered as it has never been ordered, was never ordered before, and has never been ordered since so well. Still, there were problems, because even when the system is great, you still have human beings afflicted with fallen nature, or part of it, and therefore there are going to be failings. But those in such a system, the failings are accidental, as opposed to failings due to intrinsic flaws in the system. So that's why the world around us is falling apart as we speak, is because the only thing that was holding things together under the current system, under really the Western world, abandoned the principles of the faith as its foundation at a certain point and adopted those of the Enlightenment. And any nation that adopts those principles as its foundation will only hold together for as long as there is general basic decency among its people, which is, of course, a holdover from the times when the faith had greater influence. And to the extent that basic decency remains, things will hold together more or less for a time, but ultimately it's all just running on fumes, as becomes clear once that there's nothing to hold people to that basic general decency anymore. They will just give it up because there's nothing holding them to it ultimately. Previously, there were even for very low motives such as social pressure. This was just how we act. Don't you know that divorce and remarriage is something that's evil, that's bad? Even places that might permit it, that's still frowned upon, only grudgingly allowed. Even if it's very evil in itself, only grudgingly allowed, and eventually that will wear off. The effects of original sin will run their course, and will eventually wear away that decency. And so that's where the intrinsic flaws of the system begin to show through more and more, and eventually bring down the collapse of anything built upon it. Yeah, that's what we're watching now at a significantly advanced stage of development. Hasn't completely toppled everything, but it's heading in that direction. Whereas in the Middle Ages, any problems that arose, and indeed there were problems, were due to accidental failings, due to the flaws of human nature as a result of original sin. And you can see that actually clearly. There are some signs of that. For example, the way that people examine, even those who are not talking about I have the faith, but people who are just interested in that time period, the way that they present the advantages and the whatever problems there may have been as a result of the implementation of, say, the guild system in the Middle Ages. It's clear from that the only flaws you can point out were accidental things. Maybe some people might have found ways to abuse it, but it was a good system in itself. Now, that comes clear from any objective examination of it. People say, here are the advantages, here are some problems that sometimes arose. Clearly, the advantages were those of a good system, and the flaws, the failings, were those of individuals involved in the system. So, whereas today, any problems are a natural result of the flaws of the system, and anything that ever happens as a result of the system is because usually somebody's found a shortcut past the problems, past the deliberately. The very nicest thing we can say about it is the deliberately inefficient system that we have. So this is the time we're looking at in the history of the church is one in which things have improved. There's never a time without heresy. So despite all of the heresies that we're seeing, there is still a general improvement. I'd say overall things are better for the church. It's certainly in certain aspects than in previous centuries. So, the East with one accord turns its eyes towards the supreme head of Catholicity. The majority of Eastern bishops were eager for unity in faith, which brought such peaceful repose to the West under the rule of the Bishop of Rome. So notice this, all this time we're talking about the East. Let's say the West was free of problems, everything was completely perfect everywhere, but notice there's significantly less trouble in Western Europe at this time, which again was not the center of civilization at the time. That was still the East at this point. But ultimately, it's better to be in a place where that might be less built up, but where the faith does not have so many challenges. The practice of the faith, and those who adhere to it do not face so many challenges and so much persecution. It's all pretty quiet in the West at this point. Things will the West will come to prominence later on. So the tendency towards the Orthodox faith, meaning of course the Catholic faith, soon showed itself with new energy when it found an organ in an eloquent, skillful, persuasive leader whose holiness was universally respected. And this leader was St. Basil, whom the bishops and the faithful had just made Metropolitan of Caesarea. He no sooner found himself installed than he addressed a letter in the name of all the Eastern bishops to Pope Damasus and the bishops of the West, begging their intervention to bring back peace to the church. So we have the letter. Darius relates his letter. We don't need to read every word of it, but you can imagine that it's eloquent, being from a saint and who is also a bishop. So you can read that. The solicitude of St. Damasus did not need these earnest entreaties to rouse it to action. During the preceding year, 369, he had called a council in Rome, which after condemning the anti-pope Ursinus, had given its earnest attention to the state of the Eastern churches. So the leaders of the Arian faction were anathematized. The term hypostasis was adopted to express the persons in the Trinity. So here you see a standardization of the vocabulary used to express the dogmas of faith, which is a good thing. Then passing over to a particular question, the Pope examined a notorious subject of dispute existing in the Church of Antioch, on which all minds were then held in suspense. The government of that metropolitan was held by 3 bishops, one Arian and 2 Catholics, one of them being St. Meletius. Since Arian had long been excluded from Catholic communion, his claim was not to be considered, but it was harder to settle the matter of the 2 Orthodox, 2 Catholic bishops, the 2 who actually hold the faith and have not been excommunicated. Both elected under extraordinary circumstances in the midst of persecution, and each exercising authority in perfectly good faith over portions of the population equally devoted to their respective pastors. So there somehow some confusion arose in the midst of persecution. There was some disconnect, which can happen under stressful, under very difficult circumstances. So the question is, okay, how to settle this? Definitely the Arian, no question. He gets nothing. But, okay, you cannot have 2 bishops of the same diocese. How do you deal with this? So apparently dividing the diocese into 2 was not a possibility, given the circumstances. Again, they're both ruling over the same people, or supposedly. Some think one is the actual bishop, the other group thinks that the other is. So it's probably very confusing situation. So, seeing the utter impossibility of choosing between the 2 bishops equally worthy, the perception was one is not clearly better than the other, so how do we choose this? So is it possible to do that without exposing a part of the population of Antioch to the danger of a schism? St. Damasus decided that Paulinus and Meletius should govern the church of Antioch together, with this express condition that on the death of either of the 2, the other should remain sole bishop. So there was some special arrangement whereby they shared responsibilities. So it's highly unusual, of course. But in this instance, when you have a saint involved, Saint Damasus, and also another saint involved in the governing of the diocese, perhaps some arrangement could be reached. So it seems they figured something out. The decision was applauded throughout the East. Another discussion had arisen, though, touching the orthodoxy of Marcellus of Ancira, who was charged with impugning the eternity of the Son of God, teaching that he did not exist before coming forth from the Father, and that he ceased to be after returning to him. That's heresy, of course, and such questions constantly arising. This is not one on which we need to spend much time. So we'll move on to the accession of the Emperor Theodosius, whom Theodosius I, there would be at least one other, whom Darius at least calls Theodosius the Great, who confirmed all the hopes of Catholics. And certainly he did much to further the cause of the faith of the church. The universal rejoicing which reigned throughout the church was suddenly checked by the death of St. Basil, though. So the election, or the accession anyway, of Theodosius, again, there was no really stable way of transferring power in the Roman Empire. It was usually just the army that decided it, perhaps with a great deal of bloodshed accompanying that or not. But one way or the other, the army decided who the next emperor would be. So the accession of Theodosius, the Emperor Theodosius, confirmed the hopes of the Catholics. The universal rejoicing, though, was checked by the death of St. Basil, who was mourned by the world as the doctor of truth and the bond of peace in the East. There was, let's see, Emperor, so we'll move on to some things that the Emperor Theodosius did. We have a listing there of the works of St. Basil, but we'll move past that. The Law Cunctos Populos, published by Theodosius immediately upon his accession, was in substance in order that all the subjects of the Roman emperors should hold the faith of the Roman pontiff, which is good, meaning, of course, the Catholic faith. Those alone who were in communion with the Pope were entitled to the name of Catholics. All others were looked upon as heretics. So, yeah, these are good laws in themselves. Justified, not only justified, but necessary. It's necessary that it be, in fact, required that the Catholic faith be the religion of state. Not only the religion of state, but the only religion recognized by the state. And that, yes, that it be, in fact, an offense, a civil offense, a crime to hold heresy. So this is perfectly correct. Be certainly looked upon with absolute horror by most people today, but this is in fact correct. For reasons we've talked about at length before. The legislation of Theodosius breathes throughout the true spirit of Christianity, whose discipline he had embraced in ascending the throne. St. Osculus, Bishop of Thessalonica, had administered to him the sacrament of baptism in 380 AD, and every exercise of his newly acquired power showed an obedient and devoted son of the Church. He confirmed the decree of Valentinian I for the release of criminals on Easter Sunday, and whilst signing it, he uttered the sentiment, "Would to God it were in my power to raise the dead." So, during the season of Lent, he suspended all criminal cases in the courts of law. It does not become the judges to punish criminals, he said, at a time when they themselves look to the divine goodness for the forgiveness of their own crimes. So that's a pious reason to suspend the criminal prosecutions at that particular time and during Lent. The seed of the gospel had evidently borne fruit abundantly in the heart of Theodosius, and the same spirit reigns in his civil laws. He prescribes the severest punishments against informers. He orders that the prison registers be examined every 3 months by an inspector in order to shorten the time of detention before trial. He took measures to systematize the assessment of taxes, to put a stop to embezzlement and speculation, to check the needless extravagance of provincial governors who ruined their subjects by costly and useless structures. So just to be clear, that whatever punishments he's putting forth against informers does not mean that it's evil to report someone who is actually guilty of some serious crime that does in fact need to be punished. That is not evil, and sometimes it's obligatory. Somebody whose crimes might endanger the common good or cause serious harm in some way to other people, that person needs to be brought to heel for sure. So this is though to probably to stop those who are, you have to look at the exact particulars of it, but probably something along the lines of preventing people who want to gain some kind of reward for it from falsely accusing anyone else of crimes. So the Church of Constantinople had long been given up to Arian bishops, and was accordingly the most desolated of the East. The death of Valens and the accession of Theodosius gave the Catholics a promise of brighter days. They called upon those who were the members of the Church of Constantinople, that part of the church, those faithful Catholics residing there, called upon St. Gregory Nazianzen to take upon him the government of their church. It was now some years since he had retired from the see of Sassima, and he had been enjoying his beloved solitude. And so he did in fact take that upon himself, the government of the diocese of Constantinople. And the Council of Constantinople met in the month of May of 381 AD. And this is one that was actually a real council, of which St. Damasus had been notified, and of which he had approved. he had given his instructions to St. Asculus regarding the chief question to be treated, the election of a successor to St. Gregory of Nazianzen, who had eventually gave it up. The questions of dogma had already been settled by him in his letters to the Asiatic bishops, and the profession of faith which he sent them had been signed by more than 150 of their number. So all the Orthodox Catholic bishops had received the additions made to the Nicene Creed and confirmed by the Fathers of Constantinople concerning the divinity of the Holy Ghost. Remember there was a heresy that began to arise challenging the divinity of the Holy Ghost. The marks of the Church, the unity of baptism, the resurrection of the body, and the life of the world to come. So all of that, also decrees handed down on all of those points, all of which is, notice we are the beneficiaries of all this now. All of this has been very clearly laid out for us and has been that way for a long time. Now to get at least the bottom line on all of these points, all you have to do is open up a catechism book. And you have the basic catechism for children preparing to receive First Communion, and you have all of the essentials on all of these points all very clearly laid out. No question whatsoever. Presented in very simple language. On the other hand, though, you could spend a lifetime studying all of this, any one of these points even. So we call attention to these particulars because the Council of Constantinople, which was the second general or ecumenical council, was not presided over by papal legates, which fact has been put forth, to prove that a council could have ecumenical authority without the sanction of the sovereign pontiff. So that's actually not true. In order to have any value at all, actually, any ecclesiastical proceedings have to be approved of by the Pope. Whether tacitly, that is to say, whether he simply lets it go, lets it be implemented, or explicitly approving of something, anything that has effect, anything that has a value, anything that has force in the Catholic Church has it ultimately because the Pope authorizes it. Ultimately. Even if it's immediately authorized by a local bishop or anybody with authority to authorize anything, that power to do so is ultimately derived from Christ through the Pope. The Pope is the one who receives the only one who receives his authority directly from Christ. Everyone else receives it at least through the Pope. So, the Council of Constantinople was, in fact, this is the point, ecumenical only through the sanction of the popes, who confirmed all its acts, or almost all of its approved acts were confirmed by the sovereign pontiff, approved of its letter and spirit, and pronounced its doctrine to be that of the universal church. The bishops present at the council at first assembled under the presidency of St. Meletius, Bishop of Antioch. So this is one example, but it's not the only one of ecumenical councils or local councils, ones that were not ecumenical to begin with, ones that cannot be said to have had fathers representing the entire church, morally speaking, present at it, but which were later raised to the level of ecumenical council. So the Council of Trent is another such example. That was certainly it's greeted now with the authority granted to it by subsequent popes, but it was not actually. There have been councils that were not actually ecumenical in the sense of representing the entire church. So it's all even when the fathers of any given council that come together can be said to represent the entire church, and in that sense make it ecumenical, it has no authority, no force whatsoever if the Pope does not approve of it. The Pope is everything in the Catholic Church. All right, so the first subject of discussion was the election of Maximus the Cynic, which was unanimously pronounced irregular, so he is not the successor to St. Gregory Nazianzen. The fathers of the council declared that he could not be considered a bishop, that those whom he had ordained of whatsoever clerical rank were not to be admitted to the discharge of its duties, and that all of his episcopal acts were null and illegal. So having driven the usurper from the See of Constantinople, it remained to find a worthy incumbent. Theodosius, who was an ardent admirer of the eloquence and virtue of Gregory Nazianzen, found none more worthy to fill so important a station, so he made known his conviction to that effect to the whole council. So St. Gregory resisted, but he was at length overcome, and St. Meletius, president of the council, solemnly installed him. So he wanted to give it up, but he was not allowed to, ultimately. This was the last act of the Holy Bishop of Antioch. Meletius went to his reward, and St. Gregory was unanimously called to preside. Trouble soon arose in the council, occasioned by the death of St. Meletius. According to the agreement made between the parties, with the consent of St. Damasus, Paulinus was alone entitled, as the surviving bishop, to govern the Church of Antioch. Still, a faction of the bishops proposed to appoint a successor to Meletius and actually consecrated the priest Flavian as such. This was a means of perpetuating the division in the church, which St. Gregory Nazianzen had done all in his power to oppose. Instead, Nectarius was chosen to succeed him, and St. Damasus ratified the election. So next at this council, questions of dogma were taken up. 36 bishops refused to subscribe to the term consubstantial, so Arians are still a problem, and were solemnly pronounced heretics. The professions of Nicaea with the traditional additions mentioned above. So, again, we see a further development, in a good sense, of the formulas used to profess the faith. There was no contradiction to the creed produced by the Council of Nicaea, but certain things added to it with the authority of the Pope, certain things added to it which were always true, always held, at least implicitly, by Catholics, all those who had the faith, but which were perhaps not explicitly stated before, or at least not in that particular creed, that particular profession of faith. This is a development in a good sense. Modernists talk about the development of dogma to mean it's they're essentially they're gutting it of its actual meaning and substituting something else in its place, not really denying it and saying, "Oh, that was good for times past," but that's not true. That's not true anymore. That's what they say, and that's how they try to maintain some pretense of continuity with the Catholic faith. Say, "Oh yeah, that was true, or that was good for that time, but we know better now. Things have evolved." That's what they say, things like that, to that effect, at least. They might not be so clear about it as that, but they effectively hold that. But what we're looking at here is a true development of the actual doctrine. Not in itself. Nothing is changing in itself, but the development in the way of presenting it. We're not saying that there are any new articles of faith in the sense of, no, there is nothing added to the public revelation since the death of St. John the Evangelist. Nothing at all. That's God can still, of course, bring about private revelations, but that's another thing. So nothing is added to the public revelation, and in that sense, there are no new articles of faith. Different authors might use the term articles of faith to refer to, to individual truths, as we might look at them contained in the public revelation, or they might look at them, they might use the term article of faith to refer to some point of a definition. Garrigou uses the term article of faith to refer to things actually contained in the public revelation. So he says, that's right. He says there are since the death of St. John the Evangelist, no more articles of faith. The number of articles of faith does not increase anymore, as it did from the beginning of time up until the death of St. John the Evangelist. Every time, of course, that God in his providence saw fit to make some new revelation, but the number of articles of faith actually increased up until the death of St. John the Evangelist. But now that's done, and the only further development there is in the way of presenting that deposit of faith. So this is used to express the belief of the Church. So this is now the form. At this point, you see the Nicene Creed, which is the one that we sing or recite during Mass, is the one that is essentially the one that produced by the Council of Nicaea, with certain additions also added with of things that were always true, nothing being invented, but additions of various words expressing other truths, things that were always true, in addition, added on the authority of the Roman Pontiff. But this will actually cause problems later, adding things to creeds that were true, but which were not authorized by Roman pontiffs. That would provide later on pretexts for schism. Again, only a pretext, but that was with some degree of plausibility, and not in itself actually, there's no justification for schism, but not in itself in grounds for anything, because these were statements that were true, but they were, the only blame was in the fact that the certain words were added later with that were not explicitly approved by the Roman Pontiff. They were eventually later. But then that also, in a way, and not that there's nothing wrong with that in itself, but the schismatics and tried to use that also you can see how they could try to use that also to try to further attack the Holy See. So just keep that in mind, that there's always any kind of a change to any profession of faith that can only be done with the approval of the Roman Pontiff. Yes.
Father, how is one to view those who held a dogma before it was declared a dogma? They held an opposite view of that.
Well, that depends. There's a whole range of theological censures. You study that in De Ecclesia. That something can be solemnly contrary to a solemnly defined dogma of faith, and that's a heresy. But even before it's defined, it could still be already certainly serious theological error, for example, and that could be gravely sinful to hold, because it leads you straight to heresy. Whereas other things other disputed questions might be legitimately disputed, might be legitimately controverted, and sometimes purposely kept as open questions by the authority of the church, even when there might be some definition made on some, maybe on that very point, but some aspect of it left open, or something define some truth closely related to it, but the very controverted point perfectly left unsettled, because it's actually a great help to the church that theologians continue to do their work of doing theology, which is applying natural reason to divine revelation. That is the science of doing theology. And that helps the church a great deal, because the fact of the matter is that's very difficult. That the charism of infallibility does not make things easy. Yeah, I mean, it guarantees that when a definition is made that it's correct. It guarantees that the church cannot be led into error. It guarantees that the positive faith will never be sullied or lost, any aspect of it. Not even the least truth will ever be lost from the positive faith. But it does not mean that that difficult questions become easy to solve because of that. It means that when the Pope settles it, that will be the correct settling of it, for sure. But it does not mean that that makes it easy to determine what exactly the correct answer is. So that theologians continue to do their science, as you might call it, concerning divine revelation, applying natural reason to it, and drawing out conclusions, that's a great help to the church. Yeah, in some cases, the popes will take the conclusions reached by theologians and give that, just, if not word for word, then that exact explanation in substance as the answer in a definition. This is a defined dogma of faith, and here's the explanation for it. One very prominent example of that, the definition of the Immaculate Conception, which was for a long time a legitimately controverted question. Was Our Lady immaculately conceived? It seems St. Thomas himself changed his position on that more than once. It seems that he ultimately held that, at the very least, whatever he may have written on it at any time, that the last thing he wrote about it, he was in favor of. Garrigou addresses that question. But yeah, that's a whole really another question, and really a secondary thing of mainly just historical interest, and a very great interest to anybody with devotion to St. Thomas, of course. But in itself, with regard to what we have to hold now, it's very, very much a secondary question, because that was in fact defined by Pius IX, of course, in 1854, and the explanation that he gave for it was that provided by Duns Scotus, who, that was probably the one thing he got right in all of his works, all of his theological works. That's probably the one thing he got right, because he was always there was a great deal of it was before St. Thomas was canonized, but there was a great deal of anti-Aquinas sentiment at the time of the life of Scotus, and so he opposed St. Thomas just about everything. And one of those things was he read St. Thomas in the Summa. Yes, that was not in favor of the Immaculate Conception when he wrote that. So Scotus probably read that, and so came up with an explanation for the Immaculate Conception. And that happened to be the correct one. But in everything else, he opposed St. Thomas in everything, and that means he's usually wrong. But St. Thomas, on that particular point, at least to what he wrote in the Summa, it seems pretty clear that when he wrote the Summa, he was not in favor of it. And so what he wrote now, we know definitely to be false, and if anyone were to hold that now, that would be heresy. But when St. Thomas wrote it, it was not heresy to say that. But now it would be. Because actually, yes, the explanation of Scotus is the one contained in the definition of the Immaculate Conception. So that's one way. You say the fact that there were many centuries, and that was defined in the 19th century. St. Thomas lived hundreds of years earlier, many hundreds of years earlier. The theologians who debated it over the course of centuries. And all of that was available, all of that work that had been done on that point for all those centuries was immediately available to Pius IX in the 19th century when he put together the definition of the Immaculate Conception. Again, the fact that it was solemnly defined is because it was an act of the authority of the Roman Pontiff defining it. But he was able to put together the text of the definition as quickly as he was. He, and I say he and whomever he appointed to do the work, they were able to do that because of the work of theologians for many centuries prior. And so that is of a very great aid to the church, all that work done by theologians. So again, sometimes in definitions you'll see this or that point is defined, but theologians are still free to debate this or that. This or that is still an open question, precisely because that it be so is a help to the church. And of course, anybody with the virtue of faith immediately submits to the authority of the church. And that means that certainly anybody who's a theologian and knows the importance of that will submit unhesitatingly when he knows that the church has defined something, and will avoid even the appearance of refusing to submit. So sometimes the authority of the church will make it very clear that you're still free to talk about this, that there's no concern if you're continuing to debate this particular question. There's no concern whatsoever of disobedience to failure to submit to a definition for one thing, or disobedience even simply to the will of the Roman Pontiff. There is no will expressed here that even though this wasn't defined, don't talk about it. No, that was not the intention here. Okay, so the profession of the Council of Nicaea, with its the certain additions approved by the authority of the Church, was put forth, and in the form in which it is now sung in the Mass, was declared to express the belief of the Church. So the 7 canons of discipline, then drawn up by the Council, regulate the jurisdiction of bishops, confining it to the limits of their diocese, always saving the supremacy of the Roman See over the other churches, translation of bishops from one see to another, the form of juridical accusation against bishops, the manner in which heretics are to be received when they return to the Orthodox communion, to the Catholic faith, to the communion of the Church. So these are points. The canons of discipline are different from the canons defining dogmas of faith. Councils put forth many canons of discipline, and those are subject to change. A definition is only subject to a further elucidation, but a canon of discipline can be changed. That can be changed by the authority of the Church. So, the bishops, by this, it was made clear, if it wasn't already, that bishops only have authority in their own dioceses. So that is where they may use the throne. Not today, whether that was in use at the time, I don't know for a fact, but probably already was. But a bishop in his own diocese, in his cathedral church, certainly there, but elsewhere as well, he can use a throne, has a throne on the gospel side of the sanctuary, where he sits and faces the epistle side, as opposed to a bishop without jurisdiction who has to sit on a foldstool, which means literally a folding chair, which it is, on the floor, facing down the church. That's what a bishop has to do in a place where he has no jurisdiction. So that means a bishop of a diocese visiting another diocese, or any bishop at all in the city of Rome, aside from the Pope himself, has to use a foldstool. Because having a throne is a sign of jurisdiction. Cardinals can use it anywhere they go, except perhaps in Rome itself. But the cardinals have many special privileges, so that's a whole other story. But bishops in their own dioceses can use a throne, indicating where they have power. So only in those places where they have jurisdiction are they actually to exercise any authority and use the throne. So also bishops can be transferred from one see to another. Nowadays, well, according to the current discipline, it's all the decisions concerning the appointment of bishops. It's all made by the Roman Pontiff. There'd be some instances, perhaps some surviving instances of concordats, agreements between the Holy See and various civil powers, but those are anything in such a concordat. All of those things historically always purely concession on the part of the church to some civil power demanding some say in the appointment of bishops. And in any case, the church can say that we're not doing that anymore. At any moment, the Roman Pontiff has absolutely every right to say we're not doing that anymore. I'm not going to appoint bishops. In fact, St. Pius attempted that at one point. With regard to France, the French state, according to a concordat, nominated bishops. St. Pius X. I'm not appointing any of those. Which is really no surprise that the Third Republic should have put forward a list of completely unacceptable candidates. So he said, we're not doing no more concordat, appointing bishops side to side and sending them in. That's what he did. So the Pope can do that at any time. That might bring about accidental disadvantages to the church. The state might not live up to its promises, but historically also those states that needed promises in order to those concessions in order to, supposedly the hope was, be nice to the church, very rarely were actually nice to the church once they got what they were asking for or demanding, being so obnoxious about demanding that they were granted that concession in the hopes that they would be happy and leave the church in peace. But in practice, that was never the case. Or very rarely. It might have had short-term effects, but they always came back wanting more. So, the seven canons of discipline, we talked about those. The Arians, Macedonians, Novatians, Quartodecimani, and Apollinarists are to be admitted on delivering a written abjuration of their errors. So, all of those heretics, we've talked about them all before. Most prominently the Arians, but all those others to be admitted on delivering a written abjuration of their errors. The heretics who changed the form of the sacrament of baptism, as the Eunomians, the Montanists, and Sabellians, who baptized with a single immersion or without the Catholic invocation of the three persons of the Blessed Trinity, could only be reconciled to the Church having received Catholic baptism. So, in itself, actually, it's one washing with water in baptism is itself that qualifies for valid matter. We don't have all the details available to us here, but it seems that those who were doing with only one immersion were doing something to invalidate baptism, something else. That doesn't necessarily mean that when you see something like this, doesn't necessarily mean that that the single immersion in this instance makes that by itself that is invalid. It is required, yes, and now a triple aspersion, the flowing of the water on the skin of the head in the form of 3 separate crosses is required for lawfulness, but that is for lawfulness. That just one or 2 would suffice for validity, but 3 are required for lawfulness, and that is a serious requirement, but it is, for validity, just 1 or 2 is sufficient. The ritual of the Catholic Church is most definitely to be followed, no question of that. But there is this question, of course, of lawfulness versus, there's always a distinction, lawfulness versus validity. So, so in this instance, we have to understand this to mean that those who do that, those who were conferring baptism with a single immersion, that's an identifying factor rather than the invalidating one. So those who do the baptism with only one immersion, those people, their baptisms cannot be trusted. Also, of course, anyone who baptizes only without the mentioning explicitly the 3 persons of the Blessed Trinity, that is definitely invalid. 3 persons of the Blessed Trinity must be explicitly mentioned in the form of baptism. So here you have an instance of heretics invalidating baptisms. That can't happen. So, yes, there have been many pronouncements in the history of the Church concerning which baptisms conferred by which heretics are to be considered valid and which are not. Also, sometimes are to be considered valid with regard to their legal effects, but not with regard to validity of administration. That's another distinction to make. So, in other words, the Church has laws concerning attempted marriages between Catholics, baptized Catholics, and baptized non-Catholics, and baptized Catholics and unbaptized persons. And the law is that attempted baptisms between Catholics and unbaptized persons, those are invalid without dispensation. Whereas mixed marriages, those can between baptized Catholics and baptized non-Catholics, but there's a different set of rules regarding those. So the question is then, in which baptisms by heretics can be considered to have produced a baptized non-Catholic? That's addressed by the question of which baptisms are to be considered valid with regard to their legal effects. So these are heretics, in many cases in the history of the church, especially at the beginning of the existence of a heretical sect, heretics who have just broken from the church and forming their sect retain many Catholic practices. For example, the valid conferral of the sacraments, gravely unlawful, gravely illicit, mortally sinful for them to do that, but who still retain enough Catholic practices that their sacraments could be considered valid. In those cases, popes have pronounced that those are to be considered valid. There have been many particular pronouncements, but actually in some cases, there have been instances of Roman congregations stating that up until this year, the baptisms in this sect are to be considered valid, but after this year, they have to be considered doubtful, have to be investigated. And if we have to adopt a similar policy with regard to the Novus Ordo. Currently, our policy is anybody baptized 1990 or afterwards, that has to be at least investigated to determine whether that's valid or not. But our only debate on that is whether to make the year earlier or not, because definitely Novus Ordo baptisms are not to be trusted, not in general. If you know it, you might be able to point out this or that Novus Ordo priest, whether validly ordained or not, who's in the habit of baptizing validly, but that really boils down to the question of a particular case, because or some number of particular cases. Which baptisms are we talking about in particular here? Because in general, they most certainly cannot be trusted. Most definitely, there is a general problem in the Novus Ordo. So in this instance, we're looking at here, these are heretics whose baptisms, as a rule, cannot be trusted. So the heretics who had changed the form of the sacrament of baptism, who had baptized with a single immersion, or without the Catholic invocation of the three persons of the Blessed Trinity, could only be reconciled to the Church having received Catholic baptism. But the most celebrated of all these canons is the third, which ascribed to the Patriarch of Constantinople the precedence after the Roman Pontiff, for the reason that Constantinople was the new Rome. Remember, the capital of the empire had been moved from Rome to Constantinople. So that gave the East, with its problems of excessive nationalism, which would later on lead to schism, got the idea, okay, that automatically affords the bishop of this city special privileges. Second, because the capital of the empire was moved from Rome to Constantinople, the Pope is the Bishop of Rome. The capital of the empire is now Constantinople, the second Rome. Therefore, the bishop of that diocese has privileges second only to the Roman Pontiff himself. And that is, we'll see, not true. It was on this ground that the patriarchs of Constantinople subsequently based their claim of jurisdiction over all the churches of Asia and took to themselves the pompous title of ecumenical patriarchs of the East. This canon, notice, of the General Council of Constantinople never received the approbation of the See of Rome, which is ultimately the only approval that matters. Pope St. Leo the Great, in 451 AD, in his letter to the Council of Chalcedon, where the heretic Nestorius was later condemned, declares that by this want of sanction it has been from the first utterly nullified, so it never counted for anything, this canon. It was never approved. It has been from the first utterly nullified, and he sums up the apostolic tradition touching the rank of the patriarchs in this invariable rule: the See of Alexandria shall lose nothing of the dignity it derives from St. Mark, the disciple of St. Peter. The Church of Antioch, birthplace of the name of Christian, by the preaching of the same apostle, shall keep the rank assigned it by the regulation of our fathers. Let it never lose its place as third in order. So these are dignities assigned to these sees granted by the Roman Pontiff, who is the only one who can organize sees by order of dignity. The only one. Nobody else can make any claims. Oh, well, but this is the second Rome, so that beats anything the Pope says. False. Utterly false. Yeah, any title of the title of patriarchate, for one thing, is nothing other than really something that indicates that this bishop is to receive special honor for some reason. Yeah, in itself, a patriarch is a bishop of a diocese. Maybe he's a metropolitan in the general terminology of the church. Maybe he's placed in some way, in some limited fashion, over the other bishops in his metropolitan area. But ultimately, all of that is decided by the Pope as well. So all questions of jurisdiction in the Catholic Church, in other words, are all at the discretion of the Roman Pontiff. He can do anything he wants. He can do anything he wants. Absolutely speaking, he can do anything he wants. That's to say, there are. If you were to command something sinful, obviously that would not be authorized by Christ. But we're talking here in some particular case, if we were to try to order something evil, yes, that would not be authorized by Christ. But in principle, barring any such particular cases of individual evil commands, anything decreed by the Roman Pontiff is the last word, and that is that for sure. And he can do, in that sense, he can do anything he wants in the Catholic Church. Okay. Domine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen. Sub tuum presidium confugimus, Sancta Dei Genitrix, nostras supplicationes et despicias in necessitatibus, sera periculis cunctis libera nos semper, Virgo Glorios et Benedicta.
Amen.
Domine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.